So the first ones are human responses, and there's H parens, HD, and then HD parens down here in the bottom one. And so that a parentheses means it's imaginary or not a real person, and D means it's a detail. So a whole human, a person, two people. A human detail might be a foot or a face. The most common one is a face. Okay? A monster, an angel, a cartoon character would be a parenthesized. And these are the same things in a comprehensive system. Okay? And then we do the same thing for animals. All right? And that's the scheme there. And those are kind of, they're the most common or the ones that are most interpretively notable. At least human is, so that's first.
So science fiction alien figures, that's always confused me.
So those would be parens.
Well, yeah, but they're more animals according to yours than humans.
So sometimes there is some confusion about parentheses, about whether or not it's imaginary and whether or not it's a detail. And so science fiction creature, so there are H versus A.
Yeah.
Okay. And say, so you have science fiction creatures. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there are two levels where you try to say, is that an animal or is that a human? It's parenthesized, but you don't know. And there's two things you look at, and you let the subject take the lead. If they describe them as people, and they get at some point, or they say it's a person, so we have classification language. At some point in the response phase or the clarification phase, they'll use classification language. And that you go with the flow, even if it comes late. You just go with.
A little 15-year-old
right.
kid say, "This is like an alien that I saw in Men in Black with his chest ripped open, and here's his lungs."
Okay, so I would probably code that human with if their chest, if they're gesturing to their own chest, and there's his lungs, and they're saying his and that kind of stuff. So what happens, if it has a tail and fur, and that's the same thing. It's the classification language, and I forget the other term that we use, but the descriptive language, the feature language. If the biggest one you usually say is bipedal, to having 2 feet, 2 legs, okay, upright, and more likely or not, that's going to indicate a person. And sometimes they have a full face view, and they describe the face in a way that looks like a person. And you go with the feature description. So you look at the classification language, that's the biggest thing, and then the feature description. And hopefully you won't have to ask too many questions about it. Okay, and we'll have a lot of examples, hopefully some examples in the 2 records that we're going to be looking at. So it's classification language and feature description there. So even though these areas or these sort of principles or concepts seem to handle everything, there are always responses that are in between. And so what we do in the manual in the advanced chapter is try to identify the thresholds, like where an animal becomes a human, and what we look at. Those thresholds all seem to be a little bit arbitrary, but we've got to draw them somewhere. And that's where the area where people disagree the most. But we tried to give the threshold examples and the threshold issues. And there's going to be an irreducible number of decisions that you make, maybe 2 or 3%. It's going to seem like a lot more because you're focused on those, where people disagree. And so in terms of content, these are the content categories that we code. Okay? Anatomy, art, anthropology, their code for cultural context and clothing, explosion, fire, sex. And so in terms of there's a lot of, a number of content categories in the comprehensive system that are not brought over to rpas. Okay? One of our goals was to try to simplify things. And in some ways we succeeded, in some ways we made things more complicated. And seemingly more complicated. That what we did is we dropped all the content codes that didn't have a clinical research base in the literature. Okay? So, for example, science is not in here. Okay? If somebody gives a lot of real scientific themes, then they have a technical interest, they have a scientific interest, and it might be replacing something else, who knows. Okay? But it doesn't have an evidence base in the field as being related to clinical issues. And we didn't want people scoring anything they weren't going to interpret. So that's why landscape and botany and nature are not there. They used to be a big part of the comprehensive system. They used to be something that people disagreed about and got caught up in coding. We don't have those. Okay? We don't have science. We don't have household, that sort of stuff. On the other hand, it is very, very clear in the literature that the content makes a difference, and the content is related to what the person's interests, preoccupations, or sort of defenseless styles are related to. Okay? It's not that they're not critical, but you can also look at that thematically in the qualitative phase. We want to reduce some of the coding load on you.
But if we get a landscape response, how do you code that?
Okay, so what happens is everything that's not here gets coded as not classified.
Oh.
So it's NC. Okay? So if you have an animal on card 8 and a mountain and forest or whatever, that would be animal, comma, NC. Okay? Or not even, yeah, animal, comma. Right. Okay? So, so there are going to be fewer content codes to some degree in rpas. And they're a little bit more, if you look at them, that they're a little bit more of the blood and guts. Sex, fire, explosions, anatomy. So it's a little bit more the ones that are sort of clinically relevant or dramatic or whatever. These are codes that were in the critical contents in the ego impairment index. And they go into the ego impairment index, which was a thing that Bill Perry and I made up a long time ago at a little pizza shop out in the Pacific there in Del Mar. So that the content codes are a little bit more sort of blood and guts, you know, and mayhem, and they're clinically relevant.